Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, amongst all the terror attacks that we're talking about continuously that have come out in France, there's also been an attack, or at least an attempted attack, in the city of Avignon as well in France, and that was carried out by a young man who had far-right leanings and was part of a group called Generation Identity, which is a far-right group. It's a youth-focused alt-right group that campaigns against immigration and Islam, and also espouses the white supremacist ideology of the Great Replacement, which is a conspiracy theory, essentially, which posits that white Europeans are being replaced by non-Europeans through mass migration and otherwise. Now, what's interesting about this is that this incident in Avignon is not being spoken of as much in media as the other terror attacks that have taken place in France. And certainly, of course, it's justified to speak about those other terror attacks, certainly. No one's downplaying their importance, but why not also tackle this form of extremism as well? I mean, it seems like French society as a whole has a problem with extremism at this point in time. Why isn't this being dealt with on an equal basis in that regard? Let's discuss that a bit further. And I join by Hamid, who is a political commentator. He's also a columnist and specialist on French policies. He's joining us today from the French capital, Paris. Hamid, thank you for your time today. What do you make of the incident in Avignon? Why isn't it being spoken of more?
Yeah, really. We have, first of all, beforehand, I would like to thank you for your invitation, but we have to strongly condemn this attack, horrific and barbaric attack. Of course, France is confronting with a lot of ideology, supremacist and Islamist ideology. And I think today, the politician class, I think the French political has to take their own responsibility today and to condemn and to try to unify the whole nation against the whole extremism without making any distinction between the all French citizens.
Right. So then considering, Hamid, and you're right, of course, about that you know, all forms of extremism must be condemned. But do you think, and why do you think, let me put it this way, why do you think it is that France is not talking about uniting French and is in fact talking about separatism when it comes to Islam and Muslims?
Because France today is going through a lot of ideology, extremist ideology, that is extremely dangerous for the cohesion of the French nation. And today we need to have some peaceful voice, such as me and many intellectuals, if they are Muslim or not. This is the most message important today to talk about it. And I would like to say also, the media and mainstream in France have also a big and huge responsibility to invite some extremists, are they so-called columnists or journalists, that they don't have an objective point of view, and they try to stigmatize the French Muslim community and others, such as the Rooms, such as the black community as well, and all the other minorities. This is very dangerous, and the media has to take their own responsibility, also the political class, the French political class, and we need to have a speech of unity and peaceful speech and love speech. This is the most important things today in France. That's why I suggested and proposed to the French president, since he had been elected in 2017, that France hosts more than 8 million Muslims, can ask and can demand a seat into the OIC. And I think it will be a very good idea to build, to dialogue, a cooperation between the 57 Muslim nations in the OIC and France. France is a very huge country, Muslim huge country, and this can be, I think, a way of peaceful and the message to the whole humanity. The dialogue of the civilization today is very important. Right. We need to understand each other. We need to understand. We need to have a mutual respect each other and to respect other culture. And this platform, as I said, in the OIC, will be a very good idea to build this peaceful world.
Hamid, right now we know that the political context within France is that Marine Le Pen has a lot of support in the country, right? And a lot of people are saying that the reason why Macron is giving more and more of, if we're completely honest, Islamophobic or right-wing statements is because he also sees that Marine Le Pen has more and more support in the country. In that regard, then, is it even possible, as you're saying, to have this dialogue among civilizations? I mean, doesn't France need to deal with this issue within itself first, within its own borders? It needs to come together as a society somehow.
Yes, of course. This is a very good question. Thank you for asking me this important question. Today, of course, we are presenting Marine Le Pen and Macron, but both of them, they don't represent, generally speaking, the French society. As you know, and according to the daily French newspaper Le Monde, the first political party is the abstention. We have, according to the statistic poll, more than 57% of the French people who doesn't vote. So the first party, and let's be very clear, is the abstention in France. This is very important to say it in the whole media, because some people are confusing and saying that the far right is the first party. This is completely wrong. Of course, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has an agenda.
Yeah.
He would like to represent himself and to run for the next election in 2022, as you know, the next election, and he wants to have, of course, these electors in France, and he has to change his discourse, to speak his speech, and to be more extremist, of course, and to appeal for these voters. But I think today the French society are not stupid. They know French society is confronting with many issues, many problems, such as social problem, economic problem, and COVID-19, as you know. And I think the French society today are very gathered together and with a unity of message. And this is the most important today that we have to deliver to the all international media, such as your media, Indus media.
I'll give you the final word before I let you go then, Hamid. What do you see happening in the coming days? Everyone says that this is going to get a lot worse. France is on the highest right now terror alert as well. We've had, for example, Muslim women, just those who have been talking about, a normal recipe of food, as you remember on Twitter, right-wing journalists going against those sorts of women as well. Is this about to get worse for Muslims and minorities in France?
I believe that, and I hope that the situation will not be worse. But I think this situation today is very worrying because of the hated speech in the media mainstream. They have the French media mainstream, and they should invite French Muslim people to talk and to show the message, the peaceful message of Islam. Some commentator and racist commentator, Islamophobe commentator, they are invited regularly in the French media and saying that Islam is a religion of conquest. Islam is barbaric religion. And that is very problematic in France. So we need to invite and we need to deliver a peaceful message. And of course, those people who are saying that Islam is a religion of conquest, they don't know anything about Islam, and we need to counter arguments against them and to show our religion as a peaceful religion, as he said, the Prophet and the Quran, if you kill someone, you kill the whole humanity. That is the message important that we have to deliver today. Okay. And I would like to thank you for also your invitation and also the option and the good initiative that can be launched by the French government and Emmanuel Macron is to ask for a seat in the OIC, in this organization who represents 57 Muslim nations in the world, and to open a constructive dialogue with this whole nation about the freedom of speech, about the freedom of belief, and to build an economic relationship. That's why I hope we need to distinguish also between the French government and the France nation. And the French people are not racist, but some political using the economic and the social situation for their own political agenda. That's why we need to distinguish and to be clear.
Really appreciate your time today, Hamid, and for your very important insight from there on the ground there, speaking to us from the French capital, Paris. That was Hamid Chriet, sharing his thoughts not only about what's happened in Avignon, that far-right attack there in Avignon in France, but of course also about the Nice attack and the other attack as well, of the beheading of the teacher, which are all equally, and of course especially the killing of innocents, is unacceptable and unjustified in every regard. Nevertheless, there's also really important conversations to be had about extremism on all sides in French society. Where has France gone wrong in this regard? That we have this far-right extremism and other forms of extremism as well. Something has gone wrong within this society. Why are there these sorts of divisions, and why are politicians playing up these divisions? As Hamid there said, yes, for a lot of us on the outside looking in, it seems that this is the French nation which we're looking at. But maybe he is right to say to us that, listen, we need to differentiate between what we're seeing in French mainstream media and French mainstream politicians and their statements about what Islam is, or France's relationship with Islam, and actually look at what the people of France and their relationship with Islam and Muslims is as well. That's very important and key differentiation to make. Maybe it already isn't as bad as people say, and that's the case in many places around the world where a lot of things are sensationalized for the sake of media and for the sake of deflection and distraction at a time of economic crisis, as well as, of course, a pandemic, which has been, even according to his own account, I'm sure, been mishandled by Emmanuel Macron. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. And this time we're going to discuss election spending or campaign spending in the United States. And we're talking both about presidential as well as congressional elections this year. And of course, as with all the previous elections that we've had, at least in contemporary history, we are again breaking records. So we've moved way beyond the 2016 election spending, and we're going to be set to spend around $14 billion, 6.6 of that in total for the presidential campaign, and the rest for the congressional races as well. Now, one wonders, of course, where a lot of this money comes from, and certainly we do have the laymen Americans who do donate to these respective campaigns as well. However, we do have a lot of private interest, don't we? We have a lot of lobbying groups, a lot of corporations who do donate to these respective candidates, be they presidential or congressional. And obviously, this is not money that comes without strings attached, so they're expecting something in return. How does this then affect democracy overall and the quality of democracy, as we should understand it? Is it really about the people's vote having then the final say or the final influence on how politicians then shape their policies, or do we now have a lot more power in the hands of really those who have the riches and the money, and that then buying the influence? Let's discuss that with our first two panelists who are joining us today to discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Robert Singh, who is a professor of politics at Birkbeck College at the University of London. He's joining us today from London. Joining us from Melbourne this evening is Dr. Tom Gerald Daly, who is an associate professor and deputy director at the Melbourne School of Government. Tom and Robert, thank you both for joining us here in Scope. Tom, let me start with you. What do you make of this sort of election spending and the kind of influence that it has on policymaking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big issue. I think big money has become one of the biggest issues facing U.S. democracy. And this 14 billion figure is just the latest development in the implication of big money influence on politics in the US for the past 2 decades, but especially since 2010 with this ruling of the Supreme Court, which freed up the possibility for big money in US politics. But it's not just about the access and influence that this brings, it's also that it's dark money. Increasingly, we're worried about the anonymity of donations, and there is a real lack of transparency around donations. So those are all very big issues in terms of, for some democracy analysts, scholars and journalists, they're increasingly talking about, democracy for sale, and the idea that US democracy is slowly turning into a plutocracy before our very eyes.
Robert, I don't want to overstate what we're talking about here, right? So what do you make of the situation? Do you think it is as dire as the figures may show?
Thank you for having me. No, I don't entirely agree with that. I think that there's a distinction that we need to make between the presidential election and the congressional election. There's very little evidence, at least in political science, that these donations make a substantial difference in terms of the White House. So presidents will do what they believe. That will make a big difference if we get Joe Biden in the Oval Office rather than Donald Trump. I think, as Tom was suggesting, there's much more of a concern about what Congress does and where the donations influence there. But at the presidential level, no, I'm not so worried at all on that score.
All right, so let's to Congress then, Robert, if I may. What is then the worry exactly about that? Is it that we have dark money as Tom there laid out, or is it the corporations? I mean, I would imagine all of the above, certainly, because it's not just those two. It's also then lobbying groups, right, where you have different governments around the world who are also trying to then, have more influence over a respective congressmen or congresswomen.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Again, most of the evidence of this is anecdotal. It's from people who retire and then say, this is the way that it works. And the way that it works is that you start getting campaign donations from particular corporations, and you start inserting certain things into very, very complex legislation, 2,000-page bills, which give tax breaks, basically, to particular corporations. And this goes under the eyes of the media, of the public. We just don't know why that's happening. All we see is that the Federal Register, basically the collection of regulations that constrain what businesses can and can't do, just keeps growing year in, year out. That's where the pay for play, basically, the money is kicking in.
So, Tom, I'm curious because, both of you are sitting in Australia and the UK respectively. So I'm curious to know, for our viewers' sake as well, how different that is, that system in the US to, for example, where you're sitting in Australia. How much of an influence does big money have where you're sitting?
Well, there have been increasing concerns in Australia about sort of the increasing influence of rich donors on elections. So, of course, we had the federal elections in May 2019, and serious concerns have been raised, and a number of sort of reforms have been considered, like capping the amount that can be spent on political advertising, for example. Lowering the donation threshold from 14,000 to 5,000 for, actually disclosure requirements, introducing real-time disclosure of donations, and other things to try and increase transparency in actually how money might be affecting or influencing politicians themselves, like publishing ministerial diaries, for example, and broadening the lobbyist register. So this is a live issue in Australia as well, but the scale of the money is much smaller than in the US.
So then, Robert, tell us about the UK as well in this regard. And then, if I may, then, do you think that this is an issue then that is almost stretching to many democracies, if I may stretch it that far, where we have big money that's understood that it can have influence over respective politicians through loopholes that probably exist in a lot of these nations?
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I think whether it's the UK, Europe, North America, wherever, you can't exclude money from politics. Politicians do need to actually talk to businesses as to, how to actually invest, how to get growth, how to provide jobs and so forth. And businesses, in a reciprocal way, will want to influence government in terms of, we would like this, we would like that, in terms of tax breaks. I think in many ways, this is an issue that we can't get away from. And the best way to deal with it is transparency. At least let us know where this money is coming from, where it's going, who's getting it. At least with the UK, we do know where this money is coming from and where it's going. In less transparent nations, that's more of an issue.
So, Tom, on this issue of, again, money in politics, right? Do you think it's makes sense? Because Robert mentioned there's something very interesting about how, you need to have, of course, especially if we're talking about a president or prime minister, respectively, depending on the system of governance, you need to have somebody who understands business. But at the same time, then the argument on the other side is that why do we only have rich people then who rise to these seats of leadership? Is that problematic? How does one balance that out? Because yes, you do need to have somebody who understands business, but at the same time, you need to have seemingly opportunity for somebody who is less wealthy to be able to rise up to the leadership position if he or she is capable of doing so.
Yes, I think it's a big issue in the sense that what we see is the super rich becoming increasingly influential. And if you think about, just the top 10 donors in the US contributed over 640 million in 2020 for the election campaign. We have seen a sort of record increase in small donations as well, which sort of suggests that perhaps we might see some level of rebalancing as time goes on, but that still only accounts for about 20%. And transparency will still remain a huge issue, even if you get that sort of rebalancing. So transparency remains one of the biggest issues, because whether you're looking at the UK or the US or Australia or other countries, there is just a transparency gap that really needs to be filled.
All right, so Robert, I'll give you the final word before I let the both of you go. I'm wondering, Robert, on the other side, there is the argument to be made that, listen, even votes are private, right? You don't declare your vote necessarily out in public, right? That's a very private thing that somebody does in the voting booth. Why then do you need to then have transparency to the extent of knowing who may have donated to whom?
Well, I mean, I do think there's a question there about whether political donations amount to free speech. And as Tom was suggesting there, if I donate £200 to some candidate, well, that's probably not very much. But if I donate $2 billion to some cause or some organization that's campaigning on behalf of a candidate and gets around election laws, I think that's a wholly different thing. Again, as Tom was suggesting, it's not necessarily the case that you're buying influence with this. There's not a great deal of proof about that kind of thing. But I think it's a basic tenet of our democratic systems that we should know. We should know who's donating large sums, where they're going, and whether or not they are actually getting some payback for what they're doing.
Very interesting. We'll appreciate both Robert and Tom for their time this evening and morning, respectively. Robert, they're speaking to us from London, and Tom speaking to us from Melbourne, sharing their expertise, of course, on this very important topic. We're going to continue discussing this right after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're continuing the discussion about campaign spending. As we've understood, and the details are now coming out from the U.S., about approximately $14 billion being spent on both the presidential campaign as well as congressional races, about $6.6 billion of that for the presidential campaign. And this is, of course, record-breaking considering the 2016 election, but that's been happening with successive previous elections as well, right, where we've had every election forward breaking records from the previous election vis-a-vis spending. And of course, a lot of connected details to that of dark money, lobbying groups, corporations, and of course, possibly just the fact that this is the way it's set up, that big money does buy some sort of influence in politics. And maybe that's not always necessarily a bad thing. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Carlos Figueroa, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Politics at the School of Humanities and Sciences at Ithaca College. He's joining us this morning from Ithaca, New York. Joining us from Cape Town, South Africa, is Dr. Anthony Butler, who is a professor of political studies at the University of Cape Town. Anthony and Carlos, thank you both for your time today. Anthony, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of these sorts of figures? I mean, it's hard to even wrap our heads around $14 billion, right, just being spent on a campaign. But what does this mean for A, democracy, if I'm not overstating that, but B, also just the kind of influence that both corporations or whoever is really giving the really big chunk of this money gains from this?
Well, I would start with a caution that it's a big country and a rich country, and democracy costs money. And it costs money because you need a party infrastructure, you need party offices, education programs, training programs, you need to select candidates, you need to debate policy. You also need a broad battle of ideas and ideologies to be funded, and that in the US system involves a variety of think tanks, foundations, and lobby groups that are important for the functioning of democracy. And then you have, which is our focus now, you have the cost of the campaigns. And campaigns are not cheap anywhere. So the sums are huge, but they are a problem in countries around the world with very different political systems.
Indeed.
And I think we shouldn't exaggerate the uniqueness of the challenges that the US faces.
Carl, that's a very good point, isn't it? As Anthony there said, democracy does cost money. You have, the campaign, you have these campaign offices that need to be set up. There's a lot of infrastructure. A lot of work goes into having these proper votes. Does that provide the context for why we need more and more money every successive election to this extent?
I think it does. So Anthony is right that the size of the U.S. and the diversity of interests that are always competing play a role in the way that money is basically opening up access to many groups at this point. But to your question as well, in terms of if it is something that's good or perhaps hinders democracy, that is one of the critical questions that we need to ask as money continues to flood in every single election, including midterm elections as well. And at the same time, we have lower voter turnout. Sometimes turnout increases depending on if it's a new candidate, Barack Obama, for instance, or even a new ticket or something that is unique, McCain and Sarah Palin, in terms of the presidential elections. But of course, money can lead to problems. It does lead often in mistrust in government. So that's another explanation in terms of why voters do not turn out. This year, it's going to be an exception because, again, we are living through a different era with the Trump administration. But also the idea that corporate interests sometimes overtake voter interest.
Yeah.
So we have to question whether democracy is working in a traditional sense in terms of the people at the center of the system. So it is an interesting dilemma in a way. We do need funding because the system is built and has developed in that way to pay for these ads.
Exactly.
And of course, the corporate media, of course, plays a big role in generating and trying to get all these funds, right? With advertising, paying of staffs, campaigning across the country, and the like.
Yeah, and that's also a good point, isn't it, that Carlos is making. No one, I imagine, Anthony, gives out huge sums of money without strings attached, right? I mean, you, as a corporation, our lobbying group, I mean, if they're the ones who are giving out huge sums of money, and they probably are, I mean, if we're completely honest with ourselves, they want something in return. So in that process that happens behind the scenes 99.9% of the time, do you think that is something to be concerned about?
Oh, yes, very much. And I'm sure you're right that most, particularly large donors, and in the US case, a relatively small number of individuals, perhaps 400 or 500 individuals are responsible for almost half of the political donations for federal campaigns. Those people are not donating out of the kindness of their hearts. They're donating because they want to have the ear of whoever becomes the president or the senator. But again, I would caution a little about exaggerating the exceptionalism of the US. So in many countries, we have a fairly direct exchange of candidate funds for government contracts. And you can see for example, in a country like Brazil, that it's a very small pool of large donors who get contracts in exchange for their donations.
Yeah.
There are other countries in which we might describe them as patronage systems, in which there is an exchange of jobs and opportunities for votes and donations. And we have, in much of the world, also a more direct exchange of cash for votes.
Right.
So very direct vote buying.
So I'm just curious. I apologize for cutting you off, Anthony, but I'm just curious because you are sitting in Cape Town. What's the system like in your opinion, in your assessment, for example, in South Africa, which is also, of course, a democracy?
Well, it's intriguing that the sums of money are also increasing, but the money is equally shared between internal elections and formal national elections. So we had a contest for the leadership of the African National Congress, a party of government, in 2017, which by US terms, the funds were relatively small. It's R1 billion, or around $50–60 million, to contest for the leadership of the party. And that's about the same funding that we see for national election campaigns here.
Okay. So
the funding question is both about the selection of candidates and leaders, and also about the elections themselves, in which the people as a whole participate.
All right, so Carlos, if I may come in, Anthony, I do apologize once again for cutting you off. I just wanted to get Carlos in on that point as well. Carlos, I don't want to limit the conversation just to the United States, because of course we have many democracies around the world, and seemingly big money, if we may term it that, has understood that it can have some form of influence. At the very least, it plays a big part in many of their respective, of course, elections that take place. So is the example of the U.S. then one that should be followed by other countries, or do you think that there needs to be tweaks in the system? How does one become more transparent in the process while at the same time respecting the privacy that I imagine a corporation, a lobbying group, et cetera, would argue for?
It's a great question. One of the things that Anthony mentioned that came to mind just now is this idea that money can pay direct or be a direct influence, almost a quid pro quo, if you will, which is something that the Supreme Court has attempted to prevent at a certain level. So basically, what I believe Anthony was describing in other places existed pretty much in the U.S. in the late 19th and early 20th century, the so-called machine politics, right? All the spoils, you give me money and I will place you in my administration. I'll give you a city council position, for instance. But of course, over time, that became very corrupt. So the Congress stepped in, right, with the 1907 Tillman Act, for instance, limiting corporations from putting in money into the system. And then over the years, you have a system where regulation, deregulation became the debate. The Supreme Court had to step in terms of how much money can a corporation or a union contribute to a campaign. So they decided, again, in 1976 is the turning point where the Supreme Court of the U.S. decided that in the Buckley versus Vallejo case, that corporate money or union money is free speech. So then the free speech is what makes this a problem in the U.S. So I do agree that perhaps the U.S. is not exceptional in the way that big money, in a general sense, is playing a role. But in this case, we have a system that is being controlled more and more from the top, and creating a disparity in representation, for instance. Sometimes you don't know if a person who's elected to office is going to represent mostly the donors, what they call the billionaire class in that sense, or the voter. And you also have access to legislation, which I think Anthony alluded to that as well, One case in point, this whole debate about the Supreme Court nomination this cycle, and Senator Whitehouse made an incredible presentation about dark money in the U.S. and how all these organizations have influenced the federal court system in order to place people in federal courts. So it goes beyond just elections.
Yeah,
it's seeping its way into the entire American system. So that's the problem, I believe.
Anthony, I'll give you the final word. If you can just do it under a minute, I'd really appreciate it. About then the issue, and we haven't touched upon this, but if you can, about candidates themselves, right? So if we're just honing in on the presidential candidates, Biden and Trump, for example, in these elections that are coming up, there is that argument made that you need to be of a certain class of wealth to be able to then even become, or even think of becoming U.S. president or even candidate. Is that also problematic?
Well, I think there's an element of sentimentality there in the U.S. Not every person becomes a president, and although we like to believe that democracy is a system in which any individual can rise to become president, these are in different ways exceptional people. I think that the infrastructure of democracy in the United States allows people to rise from relatively humble backgrounds, often through the law. And I'm thinking there of people like Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, and people who are extremely wealthy, and here I'm thinking of Michael Bloomberg, can be cut down.
Right.
So although democracy is dangerously threatened at times by money, ultimately money cannot decide the outcomes of the elections.
All right, and I think that's a point to end on. We really appreciate both Anthony and Carlos for their time today, and of course for their expert insight, and of course Tom and Robert, who were speaking to us in the first half of this discussion as well. We've tried to have a balanced discussion about this, right? Not overstate the situation. Yes, when you see a figure like $14 billion, you automatically do worry about dark money and the influence that lobbying groups, as well as corporations have on politicians, and that still, yes, should be a concern. But at the same time, as Anthony there did contextualize, democracy as the way it is set up does need a lot of money to be able to carry out these proper elections as we so perceive, at least on the outside. So how does one move beyond then big money and its influence in politics? And even as Carlos did lay out for us, it's not like big money's influence is just limited to elections. It's also about Supreme Court picks. It's about a whole bunch of other influential areas in a citizen's life. How does one control that? At the same time, how does then one be able to fund what needs to be funded vis-a-vis democracy to continue? These are not easy questions to answer, but they're very important ones to debate and understand. And of course, American citizens, as well as citizens of any respective country where such elections take place and where such large sums of money are spent, to be able to woo them to vote either way, they really need to be able to understand what's happening here clearly. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.